Saving Pride arrive and model black and white. And our present military problems are distinctively not black and white, or susceptible to that kind of approach. Medievalists are used to ambivalence. The Crusade, in theory, posited a black and white world of Christian versus Muslim. And the word is generally used, as by President Bush, as a synonym for the conflict of good and evil. This is actually a birthday card that my wife sent me. It's a joke, of course. Isn't life simple, one crusader says to another, when you know you're right all the time. And that's the kind of attitude we believe we see in crusaders. Yet the reality of crusading, which is perhaps the most obvious and clearly ideological warfare of the Middle Ages, yet the reality is much more ambivalent. The participants in crusades were from the first quite prepared to make deals with their enemies. This slide is from a Spanish manuscript of the 13th century, and it shows two warriors, one Muslim, the other Christian, playing chess. Even in the Middle East, where the fighting was often very bitter, between jihad and crusader, both sides, for long periods of time, observed the norms of what was then regarded as civilized warfare, with truce, ransoming, and surrender on terms. Away from the ideological warfare of the Crusades, much medieval warfare, while destructive and particularly damaging to civilians, was inconclusive. The 100 Years' War went on for 100 years because nobody could win it until finally somebody did. Or it is ambivalent in its outcomes. The very remoteness of the medieval experience from our own throws up this contrast and throws up the ambiguities of warfare and its results in sharp relief. And this is also important because in these situations there is no, unlike World War II, there is no we to identify with. And to the extent that there is, we certainly did not always win. It's often forgotten, I think, that Europe did not exist before the Middle Ages. Europe is the creation of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. For the ancient world, it was simply a geographic expression to describe the northward and westward extension of the Mediterranean world. As Europe emerged after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, a whole series of factors forced European warfare into a particular style. A style which I tend to call agro-urban, and I must admit that I owe that formulation to Clifford Rogers, who you'll hear this afternoon. War was waged by large forces of foot soldiers because they were needed, because it's focused on seizing fortifications, which is a labor-intensive task. It did not focus on battle. Only a small portion of any army were in any sense regular troops, because agrarian society in small political units of medieval Europe could not afford large standing forces. The elite of the army were drawn from the leaders of society, who clustered round the thrones and the homes of the great, and they preferred to ride to war. Apart from anything else, you can run away quite easily if you're on a horse. And they preferred to fight on horseback. Yet Europe was a deeply seamed and narrow continent, so that geography, topography, and agriculture meant that you could not have huge numbers of horses. Instead, a narrow elite of what we call knights rode heavy grain-fed horses to war. In effect, a kind of slow-moving heavy cavalry. And you can see, I think, that this guy was not going to go anywhere in a hurry, and probably not for very long, even when he moved. But soldiers, these knights, were all-purpose soldiers. They had to fight on foot because European states could not afford specialization. The result is relatively incoherent armies whose members lived a scattered and rural life. And the strength of fortifications meant that what you preferred to do was not to fight or even to besiege, but to raid. And right through the medieval period, most warfare consists, the biggest activity in warfare, consists not of fighting, but of bullying peasants. I don't know whether Henry V ever said, as he is supposed to have said, war without fire is like sausages without mustard, but he jolly well ought to have said it, because it expresses a reality. War is largely about destruction. In that, during such periods of destruction, you have small-scale fighting. An army moves into an area, breaks up to damage the countryside and to plunder, and runs into defenders in small groups. And that means that personal qualities in war, bravery, personal ability, all these are valued very highly because it's the common experience of war. And that's why bravery and these personal qualities are so important in chivalry. Yet in the wider world beyond Europe, the dominant form of war was and would remain deep into the 18th century the warfare of the steppe people. This was a fast-moving style depending on horse archers with strings of ponies, using composite bows which were lethally powerful, backed up by more heavily equipped lancers. In the 11th century, the Turks, who came from the southern and western steppe, conquered the Middle East, which they would rule until 1918. In the 12th century, Genghis Khan established the Mongol World Empire across the Sea of Grass, which is Eurasia. The southern Turks then began the conquest of India, culminating in the Mughal Empire. In the 13th century, the Mongols expanded, seizing Russia in the west, Persia in the south, and ultimately, of course, China in the east, the Yuan dynasty. These empires totally overshadowed the medieval world of Europe. And when Europeans faced them, they did very badly. The Crusades ended up in a triumph for the steppe people, for the Turks. When Western Europe confronted the Mongols in 1241, it all ended in disastrous defeats. The style of war on the steppe produces speed and hitting power on a scale which the Europeans could not match. In fact, another Turkish group, again from the steppe, the Ottomans, seized Constantinople in 1453, and by the 16th century were the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and within an ace, really, of conquering Europe. Only the conquest of the Americas, which enriched Spain, enabled it really to resist. And at a critical juncture, the Ottomans quarrelled with the Safavids, who ruled Persia in the east, and that prevented an Ottoman intervention in the disastrous 30 Years' War in the 17th century. This rise of the steppe people is the central facet of medieval military history, and it's usually forgotten about, because our historical writing is very centered upon the European experience, the age so-called of discovery, which was effectively the age of conquest. Subsequently, European powers developed gunpowder weapons very successfully. And that tends to give us the impression of European strength and dominance. But in fact, the Europeans rose to power and world dominion largely by chance.